welcome to the show. This is Common Conversation. Let's talk about sex, right? This is a show where we are uncovering, underlaying, talking about the soft and hard things about talking about sex, right? And all the things that we enjoy. Soft and hard.
Wow. Yeah,
yes.
soft and hard.
Wow. Or we could just sweeten wet. All the things, all the
savory.
things. Yes, we can play with all of it and bring it into the space.
I just want to say this is a real wonderful way to introduce Dr. Perry to our show. So thank you.
The hot and sour, sweet and savory, bitter, and
Sometimes you know what you're walking into.
Yeah.
with a touch
sometimes
of
you don't.
frankincense.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Bless.
So, well, since we're gonna lead off like that, this is our 7th episode, right? We're having some fun. We're learning a lot. Our last episode, we were talking about how we speak to our kids, about sex and that journey, our personal journeys as well. And so, hopefully, our listeners are being able to take something away and add to their lives. There's added value in that space. But let's jump into introductions. We didn't talk about this pre-show, like how we were gonna do this introduction again. Can I mix it up?
No.
No, you cannot.
We
We're
have
going to
to
start with
carry
you
it.
like we
Yeah,
have
stick
in
with
every
it.
episode.
Because you're already doing the most. So.
Continuity.
All right, continuity and leading to consent.
We're going to start with Amir.
Hello, my name is Amira of The Amira Show. What did I say before? I like cats, the color purple. I have a couple of degrees. That's some new information. I don't have any fun facts. And I'm bisexual, demisexual, and poly. So what better show to be on? Reese, take it away.
That's okay. I got you on the fun fact. I got a fun fact. My name is Reese. I am in the U of L School of Public Health getting my Ph.D. I am a pleasure researcher. Fun fact. I'm ready to scare.
Yeah, I'm
She's looking at
already
Dr.
scared.
Ashley. Let's go.
Actually, you won't be scared of this one, but my
Dolphins
fun
again?
fact for this episode is I am all for gender equality, but I will never mow that grass. Ever.
Which grass?
That's a
Anybody's
great.
grass.
Wait a minute, Miguel.
I'm
you
for
sweep
gender
afterwards.
equality, but I'm not
Well,
mowing that
man,
It
grass.
went over
So-
her head.
True story.
Wait.
Just gonna let it ride.
We are talking about pubic hair, right?
I thought
No,
she
I'm
was
talking
talking
about my
grass.
lawn.
Oh!
I will never
Miguel,
do
I
that.
heard that too.
She said,
That is a male-centered activity
She
for
keeps
me.
owning it. She's like, my lawn, my hair. Like, I mean.
Because I have
You
my
know
house.
what?
She has
I'm
her
going.
house.
I'm
Well, I
going.
have
lawn.
my
we
house.
gotta establish
But
a
I will not
baseline.
mow.
Great fun fact. I'm here with you. I ain't doing
All right, we're
shit.
coming back.
I'm here for gender equality.
It's an
Anybody
all-day
can wash the
situation.
dishes, but only you can mow
She
that
ain't cutting the
grass.
grass.
I'm here for it.
We gotta talk
Okay.
about this whole grass cutting thing.
No, we don't.
Which
It
one?
is what it is.
They're outside.
Oh,
It is what it is.
Bless.
Yes. All right.
I don't even know what to say. Hello. I feel like I always end up in the same position. Like every time
I
I'm
love you. You always
baffled.
come after my
you're
fun
like, hello,
fact.
I'm flustered.
Hi, I am
Always
flustered.
after my
I am Dr. Ashley Anderson. I am flustered yet again on episode 7. I will get it together eventually, but I am a women's health nurse practitioner. I got my doctorate and master's degree in nursing at the University of Louisville. Go Cards! And happy and flustered to be here.
Happy and
Let's go.
flustered
Well, she
to
did look at you specifically.
Yeah, because she knew what was going to happen.
I
We
knew
did
that
this
your
with
face.
dolphins.
The dolphins
They gave
one?
me a horrible fact about dolphins that I wasn't prepared
That
for.
one threw me for a loop
It was
too.
horrible. I mean, well, it just made me look at all the things that I thought about dolphins very differently. I'm still digesting that.
The fun fact was that they are bisexual.
They show bisexual tendencies, and they are a very horny animal.
Yeah, they have rape
So
caves.
I'm thinking about things
Who
like
knew?
Free Willy and all,
Wow.
like, it's a lot.
That brings a brand new meaning to freewheeling.
Absolutely.
That's what the
Let's
doctor
go,
said.
Dr.
That's what
Perry.
the doctor said.
Very
Yes.
free.
So Dr. Armon, can I go with Dr. Armon? Is that okay? Or Dr. Armon Perry? How do you
Armon is
prefer?
fine.
Dr.
Armon is
good.
fine.
The whole government
Will you
knows that.
introduce yourself? Tell our viewers, because I love how you just jumped in there, Free Willy. Who you are, what you do.
He's comfortable here.
It's right there.
Sure, my name is Armon Perry. I'm a professor at the University of Louisville, going into year 16 at the university. I graduated from the University of Alabama, and I studied, there you go, roll tide. And
Oh, that's not. Okay.
I study fathers and I study families, and I could not be more excited to be here. This is already more than I was bargaining for.
Well, we appreciate you being here. So this particular show is kind of is a part two to our last conversation with Tia in terms of how we talk to our children. And we want to kind of take a deeper step in, since you focus on young men and families and that thing, like bringing it in and saying, how do we have this conversation with boys? What should men know? What should young boys know as they become young men and then grown men as it relates to sex? Protecting themselves, protecting their mates. And so just kind of a round stat real quick, right? So looking at that 42% of men are sexually active as they get into high school, right? And are not using condoms. Something that is alarming, right? As we think about, how diseases are transmitted, how sexually transmitted diseases go across. And I always thought about this in a sense because for men, sometimes it's harder, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, to get a disease than it is transgender disease because it was women. And this is how I learned it, is because men have an outie and women have an innie. So basically the disease can sit on the top of a man's penis, and as he inserts into a woman, then that is transacted. And so a lot of times men don't get it unless it's the other way around. And I thought that was a really neat thing to learn. And I wondered if, we miss teaching that to young boys as that journey goes through with conversations. But I'd like to hear your experience in terms of...
Also, let me preface this by saying that Miguel tends to ask 75 questions in one question, so feel free to pick the ones that you'd like to answer, and we will talk about them from there.
Sure.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you for the disclaimer.
the long conjunction sentences.
You can type it at the bottom.
There you go. I think that there's a lot of room for discussion and conversation about the ways in which boys are socialized around sex. I think that a lot of young men are socialized to be aggressive when it comes to sex. Someone brought up the word consent a few minutes ago, and so I think that should be a part of the conversation. The idea that consent is an ongoing and fluid situation, right? I think that that's important for young men to know. I think it's important for young men to have trusted adults in their lives where they can go and get good information from. I'm thinking back to my own experience when I was younger, and I've found that this is the case for large numbers of young men who I've encountered in my research, is that when they don't have trusted adults to provide them with good information, then they end up filling in the gaps from whomever, wherever, and they end up with a lot of myths and a lot of urban legends that becomes the gospel to them, right? When I was younger, there was the idea that if you had sex with a young woman in certain positions, then...
You don't get pregnant.
Right.
You don't get pregnant standing
Gravity
up.
is supposed to help you for some reason.
Right. And so there's a lot of things like that I think, absent, again, good places to go to get information from trusted adults, young men end up misinformed, and these things get passed down from generation to generation. So I think those are some of the reasons why these conversations are particularly important. When we're talking specifically about the African American community, sometimes these conversations are taboo.
Yeah.
And so we need to, I think, lift the veil and have open and honest discussion and conversation so that we can all be as safe and as transparent as is possible when it comes to these conversations.
What do you think, and I'm just curious, and maybe you have an answer, or maybe y'all have an answer, what makes sex taboo as a conversation in the Black
I
community?
was so gonna ask that question.
So it's interesting. I don't know if you all knew this or not, but a couple years ago, I had a book published called Black Love Matters.
Oh, I circled it on here. I was gonna ask about it.
And what's interesting about, I think it's the third chapter, is called Let's Talk About Sex, right? And so in that chapter, one of the things we discuss is the history of Black sexuality being demonized and marginalized by the broader society. And so in response to the question, why is it that sex and sexuality is taboo in the Black community, I think it's because the history of white supremacy has always taught us that us thinking about and engaging in discussion and conversation about our bodies has been something to be ashamed of.
Yes.
And
That
the
was literally
idea...
where my head went.
The idea that Black women have been painted as promiscuous, the idea that Black men have been painted as dangerous as it comes to sex, this sort of ever-present threat of sexual assault, particularly in relation to white women. These are the things that I think have suppressed discussion and conversation in our community around sex, because in our attempt to be identified as whole human beings, we've ended up having to feel as though we need to suppress that part of us so as to present ourselves as more moral than our white counterparts. And so I think that's at least a part of the answer.
Okay. So how do we, I mean, jump in. All right. So I think about our young men, right? Our youth, our kids, you know, how do we prep them to face that scenario, right? How do we begin to make it not so taboo, and starting with our young folks?
I think it's just a part of racial socialization, right? And so we talk about the talk or the conversation that we have with our Black, probably teenagers, right? Both boys and girls. You live in the world and the world sees you and recognizes you as Black, and as a consequence of that, it's going to engage you in certain types of ways. And when our kids become a certain age, we talk to them about how is that you engage when law enforcement stops you? How is it that you engage when you're in the academic sort of space? How is it that you engage when you're going on for a job interview? I think discussion and conversations related to sex should be right up there with all of those conversations, because those interactions are just as natural as all those other things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Good point.
So I know that you do a lot of research and work around fathers and fatherhood and the impact of fathers in particular on their children. So how would you, or is there a difference between the way fathers show up for their daughters or fathers show up for their sons in the conversation around sex and sexuality?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Again, now we're speaking generically or stereotypically here, but generally speaking, men tend to want to protect their daughters as it relates to sex, and oftentimes are freer, right? Maybe a little bit more progressive when it comes to their sons. And so I think that that's a part of a discussion that we really need to have, right? Because again, we're all adults here, and one of the things that we all know is that women enjoy sex as much, if not more, than men.
Speak on it.
And so this idea that sex becomes this game where women are socialized to act as if they don't want it or don't enjoy it or they shouldn't initiate it, and it's something that they should try to withhold, and it's something that men should chase and sort of be aggressive as it relates to trying to conquer women, so on and so forth. I think that that is a part of the misinformation that leads to the repression that ends up manifesting itself in all types of negative and dangerous ways with our people. So again, I think lifting the veil and having real, true, and authentic conversations, whether we're talking male, female, non-binary, whatever the case may be, so that we can get to whatever the truth is and allow people to engage and show up in their most authentic and truthful selves.
When you say fathers tend to protect their daughters from a standpoint of sex, can you define what you mean by protection?
Yeah, so just for example, it may have been TikTok or something along those lines. I'm looking at it the other day, and
You got TikTok? What's your TikTok?
Put it on the screen.
Put it on the screen.
Sure, I think I do have a TikTok. It may or may not be active. Anything on my TikTok is this, my son and I goofing off doing karaoke in the basement.
Beautiful.
But it may have been TikTok or Instagram or something along those lines. And anyway, there was a toddler, a female toddler, a little girl. She had a pamper on, and she's music is playing, and she goes to start dancing to the music, right? And the little girl ends up about to bend over, and Dad comes out of nowhere, and he sort of scoops her up and is sort of chastising her for what he would describe as twerking. Well, it's a 2 or 3 year old kid.
She don't know what she doing.
No idea
she
what
has-
twerk is.
And if that's what she felt in that moment, I'm just like,
Right. And so anyway, so it's that sort of thing, right? Just this idea that dads tend to, again, to whatever extent possible, limit the perception that their daughters are even interested or engaging in anything that could be remotely sexual.
that's true. My dad pretended it didn't even exist. We definitely did not discuss. So yeah, I agree with you.
So it's that sort of thing, right?
Got you. So for boys though, it's projected, right? What does that look like?
Oftentimes it is. Okay. Oftentimes it is. And so again, without saying too much, but the first time I went on a date, right? The person I went on a date with, my dad set me up on the date. Okay. And
How old were you at this point?
well,
So I was
I was 16, and the person I went on this date with wasn't 16. She was older than I was, right? And again, take that scenario and flip it on its head.
Make it make sense.
Could you imagine a
Because I would
scenario?
never be set up with anybody older than me at 16 on a. I wouldn't even be set up for a
I would say
date.
Right.
being set up on a date as a woman, just no.
That's it.
I
And
wasn't
Not
allowed.
happening.
I couldn't even have a boyfriend till 17 or a partner at all because now I like girls too. But like, yeah, 17 and up, basically grown.
right. And imagine your father setting up one of his daughters on a date with an older man, right? Like
Not
we
happening.
couldn't fathom it. And so again, so that's this sort of, but I don't know if you call it a double standard or whatever the case may be, but that's the type of differences in the ways in which I think men tend to engage their daughters in discussion or conversation, or the lack thereof related to sex, and how it is in other instances, in other cases, is promoted, celebrated, and facilitated by dads when it comes to their sons.
So go ahead.
I was gonna ask a question about just, you brought up this double standard, and so we've been talking about intimacy in other episodes. Do you see a shift in fathers talking about intimacy with sons in a different way now, kind of combating that toxic masculinity narrative that has been around?
Here's what I'll say there. In the chapter in the book, chapter 3, Let's Talk About Sex, one of the things that I found refreshing that I did not think I was going to find when interviewing the men for the book was that they were interested in achieving intimacy with their partners even when it was separate and distinct from sex, right? And that was something that I was not expecting as a sort of a research finding there. They talked about wanting to be partnered. They talked about wanting to feel close, and they talked about wanting to feel connection with their partners, even if that did not involve sex, and even when that was separate from sex. Now, to be clear, they were certainly interested in having sex. Right.
Sex was not out of the question at all.
Right. But the men were able to intelligently articulate the differences and distinctions between intimacy and sex, even though the two things are related in some ways.
That's hopeful, because you do hear a lot of women saying, like, I want a partner that wants to be more like emotionally secure and more vulnerable. And the way that you were talking about, the way that we socialize men and things like that, it doesn't really give them the space to do that.
Yeah.
So it's hopeful that the new age of man is saying, this is something we want.
Absolutely.
I think we are seeing more of that. We're seeing more of that. And again, we still have work to do because, again, my experience and my research tells me that many men and women still would sort of chastise or marginalize men for being emotionally demonstrative. And so for those reasons, there are large numbers of men out there who have learned in their relationships, right?
that they can't present in that way.
Right.
Right.
And not still be respected, right? And so again, so we still have a lot of work to do, but I'm encouraged, as you are, about what it is I'm seeing with the current and new generation.
In your research, what's the age group of the men that you were studying?
Oh, so the guys that I work with, they ranged anywhere from 18 up until 62. So in the book, what I was interested in was getting a cross section of African American men. All too often in social science, what we see is what we call a deficit frame, right? Where we focus on the challenges that face our community. So you may have like adolescent dads, or you may have low-income men or something along those lines. And so I was interested in having a discussion or conversation that sort of spanned the socioeconomic continuum, the age continuum, the educational attainment continuum, because I was looking to counter the narrative that what we get in social science, at least to this point, has been people talking about black men, but very, very seldom do we talk to black men.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Got you.
So I was gonna kind of piggyback on that. Can you talk about, in general, like what led you to write this book? What was your process? And if there was anything, was that what the piece about intimacy, was that your most surprising finding, or was there something else?
Well, the piece about intimacy was certainly one of the more surprising findings. I think big picture, the most surprising thing was just how open and free the guys were willing to talk to me. Again, I'm a social worker by trade, so I walked into that project assuming that I was going to have to use every single engagement and clinical skill that I had to pull this stuff out of guys. But what I found was that it was almost as if they were waiting on opportunity, and I just showed up asking the questions, right? So that was probably the biggest and most surprising finding. When it comes to the motivation for writing the book, again, I study fathers, and marriage and romantic relationships are men's primary pathways for taking active roles in their kids' lives. So even though my primary interest is fatherhood, I have to necessarily be interested in the ways in which men are able to form unions through marriage, or at least have a respectful co-parenting relationship so they can have access to their kids. So in my fatherhood work, there was men talking about the issues of marriage and relationships and how those things either facilitated their involvement or served as a barrier. And so it led me to be interested in romantic relationships. You all are probably familiar with a decade and a half ago, Steve Harvey wrote How to Act Like a whatever.
Act like a
Yeah.
man.
Act like a man.
Think like a lady.
Act like a lady, think like a
Act
man.
like a lady. Think
Sure.
like a man. Yeah.
And what was interesting about that was people in my circle of influence were going crazy over this book. And it seemed like it was a talk all over town.
Yeah, whole
And-
movie.
Yeah.
A couple of them, I think.
Yeah.
Even people who weren't what I would describe as avid readers were picking the thing up. And so when I started to notice the influence and the impact of it just on regular everyday people inside and outside of like academic spaces, I said, there's something to it. So I picked it up and I read it myself, and I felt a little bit sort of disillusioned. What I saw was the world according to Steve Harvey. But what I was receiving from people as if it were something that was based on data and empirical evidence, and it wasn't.
It was like gospel for people.
Right,
Yeah.
That's
right.
how I
It was-
felt. I never read it because just off the title, I was just like, what do you mean act like a lady? And what do you mean think like a man? Like I felt like that needed to be parsed out more in my head, and that is like subjective, or objective, or whichever one of those words it is. Like,
Might be
so
both.
might be both. Might be both. So I never read it. So that was interesting that you shared that, and I was happy to hear you say that because I thought I was just being a hater.
So your stance is like this one book, Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, is from the perspective of one man's experience, and your book kind of brings in the perspective of multiple men's experience, and it kind
Yeah,
of
because you actually interviewed.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
you
and
actually
they're
brought them in
included,
that.
and their voices are included, and there's no one way to approach relationship.
Absolutely. And the subtitle is African American men, authentic African American men voices on romantic relationship. Because again, we wanted regular, run-of-the-mill, real people. The other thing about Steve Harvey is, again, given his socioeconomic status, his lived experiences are much, much different than Joe and Jane Public, right? And so again, I wanted to try to even out, or at least begin to even out the narrative around how it is that black men do or don't engage romantic relationships and marriage. And so that was the motivation for
Gotcha.
that particular project.
Could I influence you to take that study and bring in adolescence and puberty and seeing where young boys who are being developed by their fathers, what their thought process is? I mean, I'd be really curious. I mean, definitely as we're talking about the fact that we're getting to the point where men have already been trained, right? We're at 18, you're pretty much who you're gonna be until the next experience. And all through adolescence, you figure that out. Your mom taught it, your daughter, your father taught it, and so on and so forth. I'd be curious to see with that 13-year-old who's hitting puberty, who's really kind of learning, he's of age, right? Well, probably of age at 10 for some young boys, what their thought process would be and how free they are to have a conversation about their sexuality, their sensuality, and then sex as a whole. Would you do
I
that?
feel like you get it honest. I don't know. I feel like maybe not. I don't know. But just on that whole intimacy piece there, in my head, I was like, of course. That's what everyone wants.
Yeah.
It's everyone else who's projecting onto their children or onto other people trying to shit on that experience. So I would think that they would all just be like, yeah, I want to just love someone. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that authenticity, I think having access to good information, solid information, I think is what is in order there, right? The connection to this conversation to fatherhood is that, again, dads need to learn about child development. You need to know what you can and should expect of your kid at various points in that child's life. And obviously adolescence is one of them. Probably the biggest child development marker or milestone or benchmark in adolescence is this idea of puberty, right?
Yeah.
And that has to do with your physical ability to become a parent. And so, again, just another example, not to personalize this too much, but a year or so ago, my son asked me about where babies come from.
How old is he?
Well, he's 12 now, but at the time he was like maybe 10 and a half.
Okay.
And so I felt compelled, like it sort of rattled me a little bit. I wasn't expecting that question from a 10-year-old kid, but I did feel compelled to give him a real and true answer. And we weren't talking about a wee or anything like that. It's like, no, son, let's start right here. Every 28 days or so, right, an egg is going to come down the fallopian tube, and it's always we talked about.
Unfortunately,
Yeah,
yes.
right.
That is amazing.
Right. So,
Unfortunately.
Right.
Unfortunately for some people.
Yeah.
Both of them.
yeah. So we talked about ovulation, we talked about erections, we talked about penises, we talked about vaginas, we talked about the uterus, and so on and so forth. The
I'm
fertilization
just
of the
impressed you
egg.
even know all that
So
shit.
here's what I need
Like,
you to do. I'm gonna need you to write all that down.
Yes.
Because I have two sons.
Put that
One
in a
is
book.
4, one is 5. Yes, I'm gonna need a little handbook. Maybe write a children's book. Look, we give you all these projects.
Collaboration right
Your
here.
children's book in your
I see it coming.
Yes.
Sure.
Dr. Armon Perry talks about how to teach little boys about.
But again, but the idea is if you have solid information, then that's something you can do something with.
Yes.
Right.
Right. And again, if we're talking about sex, we're talking about informed consent, right? So whatever it is that people are doing, as long as you and I are on the same page about what's about to happen, then everything is fine. Making sure that my son is equipped with solid information so that he can make informed decisions, not putting him in a position where he's walking out into the world blind.
Right.
And so again, I would advocate for people to move beyond the stigma, move beyond the taboo, because we're talking basic biology here, right? Like nothing could be more natural. And so, I think it's high time for us to engage in these conversations in real and authentic ways so that our children aren't out here filling in the gaps with people and places that they need not be, right? My first sex ed teacher was Todd Shaw, and that's too short for people who don't know, right? So
It took him a minute. It took him a minute. We're like,
Oh, what an interesting teacher.
I did not know
Aggressive.
Two Shorts
It's a hard
government.
teacher.
No, I knew. Write it down.
Luther
Two
Campbell,
live crew.
Luther Campbell and Todd
Y'all
Shaw,
know
my first sex ed teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Terrible decisions. Terrible decisions. But again, in absence of good information, solid information, we all will fill in the gaps, right? And me and the people in our neighborhood, we filled in the gaps with Todd Shaw and Luther Campbell.
And now
You
kids
don't know
have
what you
all
don't
the
know.
things. Yeah. They
Yeah.
have TikTok and
Oh, they
YouTube
have-
and all kinds of stuff that they can try to figure things out.
Access to free porn. It's,
Right.
We were having a conversation about the media influencing what they know. And I love that you talked to your son about female parts. Even though you don't have a uterus, you should know what a uterus is and what it does. You don't have a clitoris, but you should know what a clitoris is, where it is, and what it does. And separating kids and just talking to them about what they have only gives them part of the conversation. So that's great that you did that.
I love it. It's all information. It's neutral information. Like nothing sexualized about it. Like this is a period. This is what happens. I didn't even realize it was 28 days. I thought it was 30.
It's an average.
It depends.
Oh, right, right.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm still on it. You know. Okay.
Could be 26 to 32.
I'm
just
curious
saying.
about your son's responses. Would you share, like, when you go through that conversation, like, what were some of his responses?
So again, obviously my son knows me, and so it was a really, really matter-of-fact conversation. And so when we have discussion and conversation, I'm an open book, right? Again, back to the fatherhood thing. My job is to put him in the best position possible to succeed. And so everything that I have access to, I'm going to give it to him, right? And so his response was, "Okay, Dad." I would imagine it was probably more than he was expecting. Right?
I just want to know where baby's coming
Or
from.
did I just open?
Sir, it's not just cutting point.
Right. But again, he's a matter-of-fact kid, and again, my mission is to put him in the best possible position so that he doesn't find himself in a spot where he makes a decision in the heat of the moment that ends up impacting him for the rest of his life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And then knowing full well that I had the information and I just didn't share it with him. Right.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I love that so much.
Did you have, or did your son have conversations with your wife as well?
That's my next question.
Yes, they're in sync.
That's a really, and I
kids,
don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that, but I'll find out. Maybe you have to bring me back for episode.
Yeah.
We have like 3 or 4 part 2s.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
But I
There
just
you
need to
go.
put a caveat in
There
here.
you
When
go.
you come back for episode 2, I need that handbook for myself.
Yeah, you can finish your book before you come back.
Absolutely. I got you.
But yeah, I'm just curious. We were having a conversation. We were doing consent from a mother's perspective
Sure.
and talking about sex and talking with kids from a mother's perspective, and I asked the question of like, do you get with the other parents and talk to the other parents that your kids are dating around what they're saying to their kids? So is that something that you've considered or you and your wife have considered?
So, well, my son is probably a tad bit young for that, but I could certainly see myself doing that, right? Again, for me, the same way that if he were going to the fair with one of his friends, we wouldn't allow him to go unless we knew who the other kids' parents were and had enough
That's
of
how
a
it used to be.
Right. Well,
It really is.
They had all the numbers.
absolutely. With our house, it still is, right? We live in a wild and crazy world. And so we wouldn't allow him to spend large amounts of time outside of our presence with other people if we didn't feel comfortable with those people. And a part of that assessment has to do with spending time with them and getting to know them. So that we have some sense for what they might or might not do. That's a part of the assessment that we're doing before we make the decision as to give him the permission or not. And so again, what we're talking about, these things are literally life and death, right? From an STI sort of a perspective. But beyond that, the idea that you could, again, engage in sex with someone, have a child, now you are now connected to that person for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah.
Some of us would say for the next 18 years, but I reject that,
Beyond that,
right?
yeah.
Once you have a child,
correct.
your job is to parent until one of you is no longer on this side of the dirt, right? So again, this is, nothing could be more high stakes. My job, my role is to arm and equip him with everything that I have so that he can make the best decision possible.
I don't know if this also fits into that too life or death situation, but I also was thinking on the consent safety thing as well, like understanding consent and, you know, that line. I don't even want to say it's a thin line. It's just a line of, you know, I don't know, going to jail or something, like over something.
Life-altering consequences for your
Yeah,
choices.
yeah. So I wondered if that fit in that too, because that's also what I thought of in that moment.
Absolutely. And so I'll say two things here. One thing is sort of self-serving and is just sort of a real discussion, a conversation. My son is going to be a black man in America,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? And I could remember before I even hit puberty, there was a guy in my neighborhood who ended up going to prison for 28 years for an alleged rape. Right? Now, again, I wasn't there when the deed was being done, but up until the point in time when I could no longer see the two people walking off from the basketball court where we were,
Yeah.
it didn't seem like anything other than a consensual act. Now,
Yeah.
again, this is with the understanding that I fully understand that consent is an ongoing and fluid situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
The point that I'm trying to make to you is, in response to your question, absolutely having those discussions and conversations with my son, that consent is a real thing and it's ongoing and fluid, because you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you have 12 people of your peers, right, making a decision about whether or not you're going to maintain your freedom.
Right.
The other thing is you also don't want to be in a situation where you have done something to someone and you have irreparably damaged or harmed them
Caused
because
them there.
right, absolutely. So you want to protect yourself, but you also don't want to be the reason for someone else's trauma.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
that's an incredible sort of a cross to bear. So for all of those reasons, I think that the consent conversation is particularly important in that socialization process
Yeah.
where we're having the open and transparent and authentic discussions and conversation. Absolutely.
We also talked about that from the standpoint of teaching men that they also have consent too. And if they don't want to have sex, they don't have to have sex. And they shouldn't be forced to fit into this narrative of you should want it all the time, you should have it all the time. That you have the opportunity to be vulnerable and say, not right now.
Right.
Right. Because that's definitely not encouraged.
Yeah.
No,
Not
absolutely
my
not.
experience anyway.
And you talked about the shame and the stigma, right? And so making sure that he has the courage and the willpower to be able to say, if this is not something I'm interested in, I have the agency to say no.
Absolutely. On that note, we have to wrap up. It has been a pleasure having you here.
sure.
I definitely
Yes.
want you to come back, like, so we can, because I think there's so much more that we can unpack, and hopefully those who are listening or watching, right, you've been able to kind of galvanize and grab some tools and go home and have a conversation with your wife and your friends and your family and your sons, right? See where they are. As we wrap, 30 seconds, and then we're gonna jump out of here. Start with Reese. Any takeaways?
Takeaways. Men have agency too.
Men have agency too. Let's get it.
Ditto.
Ditto.
I don't trust my 30-second game right now.
Hot passion.
Gosh, I don't trust my 30-second game
Yeah.
because this was so
We're gonna send them to the confessional room. Dr. Armon Perry, 30 seconds. Any wrap up, anything is.
Yeah, let's talk about sex. We gotta talk about it.
We appreciate it. This is Comma Convo. Like, subscribe if you want to know more. Hit the comment. Throw us some messages. We will respond. We appreciate you hanging out with us, and we'll see you in the next episode.
See you next time.